Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. I was only gone 5 days. 5 quiet, uneventful days in Austin for a land management summit. The kind of trip that promised more hours of mind-numbing presentations than anything resembling fun. I wasn't supposed to come home feeling like a stranger in my own house. The moment I stepped inside, something didn't sit right. It wasn't the way the house looked. Everything was clean, almost too clean. Jessica wasn't one to obsess over tidying up unless company was coming. The counters sparkled, the floor had been mopped and waxed, and there was a faint scent of lavender and something floral I couldn't place lingering in the air. I dropped my suitcase by the stairs and scanned the living room. New pillows on the couch, a throw blanket I'd never seen, and fresh lilies. Jessica hated lilies, neatly arranged on the dining table. "Hey, babe," Jessica called from the kitchen, sounding bright, too bright. "You're back early." I followed her voice and found her drying a pan by the sink. She was in her usual soft flannel shirt and jeans, nothing dramatic, but something about her posture, the way her shoulders tensed and released when she noticed me, felt rehearsed. I played it cool. "Early checkout," I said, forcing a casual grin. "Thought I'd beat the traffic." She chuckled and wiped her hands on a dish towel, coming over to give me a quick peck. "You could have warned me," she teased. "I'd have made dinner." "I'm happy with anything," I replied, studying her. She smiled but didn't meet my eyes for long. Jessica had always been steady, grounded. This wasn't like her. I tried to shake it off as exhaustion on my part, but deep down I knew better. As I moved upstairs to unpack, the unease followed me. The bedroom had been cleaned too, maybe even reorganized. The photo frames on the dresser had been rearranged, but one frame stood out. It was empty. The silver one with our Galveston beach trip photo was gone, just a blank slot where it used to be. I lingered on it. Jessica wouldn't just remove a picture without replacing it. I made a mental note, closed my suitcase, and headed back down, where she was already lighting a candle on the dining table. Lavender. Again. Dinner was simple, grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, but the silence between us was louder than usual. She kept the conversation busy, jumping between church talk, town gossip, and Pastor Graham's endless rants about the youth program. Then she mentioned Emily. "Oh, by the way, Em's been coming over more," she said, spearing a carrot, "helping with the garden. She's been a real blessing." I blinked. "Emily? Since when?" Jessica shrugged. "Past couple of weeks. You know her. She needs a distraction." I nodded slowly, but something itched at the back of my mind. Emily usually texted me random pictures of whatever plant she was reviving. This time, nothing. Total silence. I didn't say anything, just kept chewing while watching Jessica closely. She never once looked fully comfortable. Later that night, while Jessica showered, I wandered through the house. Something was off, and I couldn't shake it. The guest room had fresh sheets and a lit candle burning softly on the desk. The couch had a folded throw blanket draped perfectly, like it had been staged. I stepped into the hallway and noticed faint indentations on the carpet leading to the guest room. Footprints, maybe? They didn't match my boots, and Jessica never walked around in anything but slippers. I couldn't help but notice the guest bathroom had a toothbrush sitting next to hers. It wasn't there before I left. When Jessica finally emerged from the bathroom, hair wet and humming to herself, she acted like everything was normal. We settled into bed, but I lay there staring at the ceiling long after she drifted off. Every part of me wanted to believe I was overthinking. Maybe Emily had been spending more time here. Maybe the second toothbrush was hers. Maybe the lilies were a new experiment. Maybe. But when I turned toward Jessica, watching her sleep so peacefully, something heavy sank in my chest. I couldn't explain it fully, but I knew. I knew something had shifted, and no matter how well she played it off, the house, the atmosphere, even the smell, it all whispered the same warning. Something was wrong. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to know just how wrong. It was 2 days later when I found it. I hadn't been searching for anything, just reorganizing the garage, something I did every spring without a second thought. But tucked under an old moving blanket, next to a pile of worn Christmas decorations, sat a small, unassuming box, neatly wrapped, sealed with a gold ribbon. The kind of gift Jessica would usually give me for anniversaries or birthdays, but it wasn't addressed to me. I unwrapped it carefully, like peeling away the layers might somehow reveal I was just being paranoid. Inside was a leather-bound Bible, a beautiful one, expensive, with embossed initials I didn't recognize, TP. I stared at it, confused. Jessica wasn't the type to order monogram gifts for just anyone. Inside the cover was a handwritten note on cream stationery. For your guidance, your wisdom, and your patience. Gee, my stomach dropped. I knew my wife's handwriting. Clean, sharp, neat. No mistake. But what rattled me most wasn't the gift itself. It was the fact that she'd hidden it. Jessica never hid gifts from anyone. She loved giving them, flaunting the surprise before the occasion even arrived. Yet here it was, stuffed between plastic tubs and an old wreath like it was never meant to be found. I put the box back exactly as I found it, resealed it with a ribbon, and stood there, pulse hammering. My first instinct was to storm inside and demand answers. But instead, I let the anger simmer, locking it behind clenched teeth. I wasn't going to lose my temper. Not yet. Not without knowing more. That night, as Jessica busied herself making peach cobbler for the church's upcoming bake sale, I sat at the kitchen counter pretending to scroll through my phone. She was humming again, light on her feet, like everything was perfect. I could barely recognize her. The woman I married had never been this eager to distract. I couldn't help but notice she was also prepping for another women's Bible study meeting. The second one this week. I hadn't thought much of it before. Jessica was devout after all. But now, after finding that gift, the words Bible study took on a different weight. You're really into these church nights lately, I said casually. She chuckled. The women's group is just growing fast. We've been planning new retreats, counseling sessions. It's good for the community. She glanced up briefly, but didn't hold my gaze. Besides, it keeps me busy. I nodded. And TP, are they part of the community too? I watched her face tighten for a fraction of a second, the kind of instinctive reaction you can't rehearse away. But just as fast, she smoothed it over with a practiced smile. Oh, she asked, feigning innocence. I leaned back. Never mind. Jessica carried on like I hadn't said a word, but I saw the calculation behind her eyes. She knew exactly what I was talking about. I spent the next 2 days watching her more closely. The call she took on the porch, the texts she answered while turning her back to me, the sudden errands that pulled her away at odd hours. That Friday, I decided if Jessica wanted to hide gifts, I'd have my own little project. I went into the garage when she left for her so-called study group and unwrapped the box again. With a razor, I slit the edge of the leather, subtle and thin, right along the binding where no one would spot it at first glance. I then mixed a small bottle of clear adhesive with fine sand, just enough to stiffen the pages when they turned. I resealed it. Nothing that would ruin the Bible outright, but enough to make whoever opened it notice something was off. Enough to make them remember it every time they try to flip to their favorite verse. The next day, the box was gone. I waited for Jessica to bring it up, but nothing. Not a word. She carried on like I hadn't seen it, like I hadn't touched it. Her alibi remained unchanged. More study nights, more errands, more singing in the kitchen while pretending our life hadn't shifted beneath our feet. I didn't confront her, but from that moment on, I paid attention like never before. I wasn't just suspicious now, I was hunting. The game had changed. And Jessica? She had no idea that every sweet smile she offered only drew me closer to the truth she desperately wanted to hide. I followed every small clue like a bloodhound, each one pulling me deeper into a maze I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. The following week, Jessica acted like nothing had changed, like the missing gift hadn't even left a shadow behind. I watched her more closely than I probably ever had in all our years together. She was too polished now. Every movement felt rehearsed. Every smile, every conversation about how the garden needed more mulch or how the church choir was asking for volunteers felt like she was reading from script. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that I found my first real lead, or so I thought. After service, Jessica lingered around longer than usual. I chalked it up to typical post-sermon small talk until I noticed she kept glancing toward the youth pastor, Pastor Tom. Younger than most of us in the congregation, clean-cut, always too eager to help. He was kneeling by the stage packing up hymnals, and I swear Jessica was watching him like she'd lost something or found something. That evening, when Jessica claimed she needed to stay late for a women's ministry meeting, I didn't head straight home. I parked 2 blocks from the church and waited. Sure enough, I saw her car still there long after the meeting should have ended. The lights inside the chapel were dim, but just enough leaked out that I could see the silhouettes of 2 figures sitting in the front pew. Jessica and Tom, talking. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Was it him? Was Pastor Tom the one she was hiding? The initials matched. TP. Could it be that obvious? My pulse was pounding. I considered walking right in and confronting them both, but something held me back. No, I needed more than a hunch. The next few days, I watched like a hawk. Every time Jessica mentioned the church, Tom came up, always casually, always in passing, but always there. She even joked about him being too young for this much responsibility during dinner. And yet, something about the way she said it made me think she was softening the idea, like prepping me for when the truth eventually slipped. By Thursday, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to the church while Jessica was out helping with another one of those endless ministry nights. The parking lot was empty except for Tom's car and hers. I went inside and crept down the back hallway toward the main hall. The murmured voices were faint, but I caught enough to recognize Jessica's tone. Laughter. Soft. Intimate. I edged closer until I could make out 2 figures seated side by side at the altar. Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything? Tom asked, his voice low. Jessica chuckled. He's oblivious. Too busy with his land surveys to notice anything. I just need a few more weeks. I froze. My worst fears confirmed. It was him, the youth pastor. Or so I thought. I pushed the door open with enough force to echo through the chapel. Both of them turned, startled. Jessica jumped to her feet, eyes wide. David, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same, I said, voice sharp. Tom raised his hands. Hey, this isn't what it looks like. Jessica tried to step forward. David, please, let me explain. But I wasn't listening. I'd seen enough. I stormed out before either of them could get a word in. When I got home, Jessica followed shortly after, looking pale and frantic. She swore up and down that it was a misunderstanding, that Tom was helping plan a surprise church retreat for me and a men's group. I wanted it to be special, she pleaded. That's why it's been secret. I laughed, bitterly. So the gift? The late nights? The lingering looks? That's just a retreat. Yes, she cried. I swear. Ask Pastor Graham. Ask anyone. Against my better judgment, I did. 2 days later, Pastor Graham, old, conservative, wouldn't tell a lie if it saved his life, confirmed it all. Tom and Jessica had been coordinating a weekend men's retreat for weeks. It was supposed to be a surprise for me. The Bible? A gift for me, with Tom's initials as a nod to his role in leading the retreat. Jessica even showed me the original sign-up sheets and emails. I stood there feeling like an absolute fool. I had embarrassed her, suspected the wrong man, and somehow, despite all the signs, all the tension, I was wrong. Or so I thought. Jessica cried that night, heartbroken but relieved. I apologized more times than I could count. Yet something deep inside me didn't quite settle. The pieces didn't fully fit. The gift was still too carefully hidden. The glances still too loaded. For now, I played the part of the humbled husband. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. Not entirely. I just hadn't figured out yet who the real TP was. But I would. The relief Jessica showed after I apologized was almost convincing. Almost. For 2 weeks, things returned to what most people would call normal. Jessica laughed more, hummed while making breakfast, even held my hand again during church like we were high school sweethearts and nothing had happened. But even in those quiet moments, I could feel the thinness of it. Like plastic flowers, you could admire them from afar, but up close you could see how fake they really were. I told myself I'd let it go. I really did. Yet every small inconsistency only made the itch in the back of my mind worse. It was Emily who cracked it open again, though unintentionally. We were at her place dropping off extra garden tools when I noticed her eyes hesitate for just a second as Jessica mentioned the women's Bible study. Emily played along, nodded like it was nothing, but her expression faltered. She quickly excused herself to check on the backyard. Jessica didn't notice, but I did. I always noticed. Later that evening, Jessica was fussing with her wardrobe, claiming she needed something modest but presentable for the next Bible study. I sat on the edge of the bed watching her, letting my thoughts stew quietly. "Remind me," I asked, "who's leading this study again? I don't think you ever told me." Jessica didn't miss a beat. "Oh, it rotates. Usually some of the older women from the congregation. Margaret's taking this one." Margaret, 80 years old if she was a day, barely stood upright, let alone lead anything beyond knitting circles. Yet Jessica said it with absolute confidence. The next morning, while Jessica left early to help set up for the study, I paid a visit to the church. Margaret was outside watering plants, her frail hands trembling slightly. "Good morning, David," she greeted warmly. I gave her a tight smile. "Heard you're leading tonight's study." Margaret blinked. "Oh, heavens no. I haven't led one of those in years." She chuckled. Jessica must have been mistaken. Or lying. I thanked Margaret and left, my pulse racing. That's when I noticed the church secretary, Linda, locking the office door. "Linda," I called out. She turned, smiling. "David, all ready for the retreat next month." "Just about," I said. "By the way, has Jessica been in here much lately?" "She's been busy with church work." Linda shrugged. "Just the usual. Mostly room reservations." That word stuck with me. Reservations. I pressed. "Reservations?" Linda nodded. "For private studies or counseling sessions. She and Pastor Tom handle most of those. Keeps the evenings organized." Pastor Tom again. But I'd already cleared him, right? I walked away slowly, mind spinning. That evening, while Jessica hummed and baked lemon bars for her study, I logged into our shared email account. Jessica wasn't tech-savvy. She never remembered to fully log out of anything. I dug through the inbox, found nothing. Then I remembered Linda mentioned reservations. I searched for reservation, and up popped a series of automated confirmation emails. They weren't for the women's group. They were for private chapel bookings. Late evenings. Recurring. Always marked under Jessica's name, but never with the women's ministry. And there was one more thing. Each email listed the second name on the reservation. It wasn't Pastor Tom. It was marked simply TP. And the only other person in the church with those initials? Pastor Graham, the elderly, respected, universally trusted head pastor. The very man who assured me, just weeks ago, that Jessica's meetings were about the retreat. I stared at the screen, unable to process it. Pastor Graham? Impossible. He was old enough to be Jessica's father. No, this couldn't be right. The emails were clear, though. They listed him as the co-reserver every single time. That night, when Jessica kissed me goodbye and grabbed her lemon bars, I pretended to nod along. "Say hi to Margaret for me," I said. She froze for less than a second, then forced a smile. "Of course." I let her leave without saying another word. My mind, however, was already racing ahead. Because I knew now. I hadn't been wrong. I had just been looking at the wrong pastor. I could barely sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jessica walking through those chapel doors with that lemon bar tray, like nothing in the world could touch her. I replayed every detail of the reservation emails over and over, convincing myself there had to be a mistake. But there wasn't. The confirmation codes, the time slots, even the contact number, hers, all linked directly to her. I sat there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, while Jessica slept soundly beside me, utterly unaware that the man beside her had stopped being her husband the moment he realized she wasn't the woman she pretended to be. The next morning, I acted normal. Too normal. I buttered toast, made coffee, and chatted about the weather while Jessica floated around the kitchen humming church hymns like she was Mary Magdalene herself. I kept the mask on all day. I didn't ask questions. I didn't mention Margaret. I let her believe I was the same David who trusted her implicitly. But inside, I was counting every hour until Sunday. Sunday wasn't just church. It was the day Linda would hand out the finalized schedule for the upcoming retreat. Jessica didn't know I'd requested a copy early. And when Linda casually handed it to me after service, It took everything I had not to flinch when I saw Pastor Graham's name paired with Jessica's for several preparation meetings. Meetings that didn't show up on the public church calendar. Private, quiet. At lunch with friends, Jessica leaned into me and whispered, "I think you'll love the surprise we've been working on." She sounded so proud of herself, like she thought she was pulling off the greatest act of kindness, like I'd melt when I found out. I almost laughed. Instead, I kissed her cheek, a perfectly rehearsed act. "I'm sure I will," I said. By Monday, I was done pretending. I didn't have hard proof yet, not the kind you could put in front of someone and force a confession, but I had enough to know where to look. I called Linda. "I think there might be an error on the reservation logs," I said. Jessica mentioned her sessions were for the women's ministry, but the forms list Pastor Graham? Linda chuckled awkwardly. "Oh, it's no error. She's been using the after-hours slots for private counseling sessions." My heart sank. "Private?" "Yes," Linda said, lowering her voice. "Pastor Graham's been helping her with personal struggles." Personal struggles. What a polite phrase. I thanked Linda and ended the call. That night, I watched Jessica pack another dessert tray and brush her hair like she was preparing for a second date. "You're really dedicated to this retreat," I said. She smiled at me through the mirror. "It's important to me." Important. That was the word that stuck with me when I later drove past the church and parked on the far end of the lot. I waited in the shadows as Jessica's car arrived. The chapel's back door creaked open, and I saw Pastor Graham himself holding it. He wasn't stooped like usual, nor did he move like the fragile old man he pretended to be during sermons. He stood tall, confident, and when Jessica walked past him into the chapel, he placed a hand on her lower back without hesitation. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles cracked. My breath caught. They disappeared inside, and I sat there, frozen, staring at that door. I didn't storm in. Not yet. Instead, I waited. Waited until the soft glow of the stained glass windows flickered out almost 2 hours later. Waited until Jessica left alone, keys jangling, humming again. I didn't follow her home. I stayed parked, watching. And when Pastor Graham stepped out next, adjusting his jacket and glancing around nervously, I knew. I didn't need a sermon or a confession. I had seen enough. I spent the next few days in silence, watching Jessica float through life as if she hadn't shattered the vows we built this house on. She laughed, organized potlucks, gave me soft kisses on the cheek, and even made plans for us to host the next family barbecue. And yet, every word she spoke sounded to me like static, white noise covering up something rotten underneath. I didn't lash out. I didn't accuse. Instead, I listened. Every time she mentioned Pastor Graham's name, I watched her eyes carefully. She never flinched, never hinted at guilt, but I could see it. Guilt has a way of hiding in the corners of a smile. By the end of the week, I made up my mind. On Friday evening, I returned early from work, parked 2 blocks away, and walked home on foot, circling behind the property like a trespasser in my own life. The sun was dipping low, painting the town orange, when I caught sight of her through the kitchen window. Jessica stood by the counter, checking her phone with a small, secretive smile curling at the edge of her lips. A moment later, she deleted the message she had just read. Not archived, deleted. Gone. I knew that trick too well. When she left shortly after, claiming she had to help set up for Saturday's prayer breakfast, I trailed her. I stayed just far enough behind to blend with the evening traffic. She didn't head to the church immediately. Instead, she took a detour down a narrow side street behind the chapel and parked in a lot reserved for staff. I watched from a distance as Pastor Graham unlocked the back door and let her in. No one else around. Just them. I walked the perimeter of the church grounds, keeping to the trees, knowing this building's layout better than most. The windows near the back office were low and, if cracked open for ventilation, easy enough to hear through. I found one. I crouched, listened. Their voices were low, but clear enough. "Jessica, I think he suspects something." "Pastor Graham, you're sure?" "Jessica, he's been distant, quiet. He never used to be like that." "Pastor Graham, keep steady. We're almost through this." "Jessica, what if he finds out?" "Pastor Graham, then we do what we must. But for now, just keep him distracted." My stomach turned. I leaned against the brick wall, pressing my fist into it hard enough to feel the scrape of the mortar against my knuckles. Distracted? I wasn't sure what was worse, the betrayal or the plotting. I could have ended it right there. Stormed in, demanded explanations, humiliated them both. But that would have been mercy, and they didn't deserve mercy. Instead, I left quietly, circling back to the car, letting the rage settle into something colder. Something patient. Back home, Jessica returned hours later with takeout in hand, like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek again, laughing about how Sister Margaret kept burning the muffins during setup. I sat across from her at the table, watching every word, every gesture, knowing now with certainty that every smile she gave me was for herself, not for us. Later that night, as she dozed off beside me, I scrolled through her phone while she slept. She wasn't careful anymore. Hidden among her deleted texts were calendar entries, private chapel bookings marked discreetly, but clearly shared between only two names, hers and Pastor Graham's. Weekly, consistent, and always late. There it was. The confirmation. Not just suspicion, not just circumstantial, undeniable. I turned off the phone, slipped it back onto the nightstand, and lay staring at the ceiling, calm, steady. My mind was already building the next step, because this wasn't the end. Not yet. Saturday morning came with the chirping of birds and Jessica's usual gentle hums echoing through the house. She packed for the church's prayer breakfast, like she hadn't conspired with a man old enough to be her father behind those stained glass windows. I pretended to be preoccupied with oiling the hinges on the back gate while I watched her load lemon bars and casserole dishes in the back seat, all smiles and good cheer. She kissed me before leaving, a soft, distracted kiss that felt hollow compared to the storm swirling behind my eyes. As soon as she turned the corner, I locked the gate, wiped the grease from my hands, and drove to Emily's. Emily opened the door, instantly worried. "What's wrong?" she asked. I stepped inside without answering, pacing her living room like I had never done before. I finally told her everything. The late-night chapel visits, the secret reservations, the deleted messages. And when I said Pastor Graham's name, she sat down hard on the arm of the couch. "You're sure?" she whispered, as if saying it aloud would collapse the walls around us. I nodded. "I saw them," I said. "I heard them." Emily's eyes flickered between heartbreak and fury, but what struck me most was her next sentence. "She's always been like this." I blinked. "What do you mean?" Emily looked ashamed, but the truth spilled out anyway. Growing up, Jessica was different. She always knew how to get what she wanted without getting her hands dirty. Even when we were kids, she'd make me the scapegoat when she stole from Dad's wallet or snuck out at night. But I never thought she'd do this to you. That night, with Emily's reluctant blessing, we put a plan in motion. The next morning would be the church service. Packed congregation. Perfect stage. Jessica wouldn't see it coming. I spent the rest of Saturday preparing, gathering the small details only a pastor's wife would know how to hide, but forgot to wipe clean. I printed the reservation sheets I retrieved from Jessica's account, stacked them neatly with screenshots of the hidden calendar entries, and a letter I wrote personally. Not to Jessica, not to Graham, but to the congregation. Sunday morning arrived like a calm before a storm. Jessica stood before the mirror, adjusting her modest floral dress and fixing her hair with the same quiet confidence that I'd once loved about her. She didn't know I had already delivered the sealed envelope to Linda, the church secretary, to be handed directly to the church board during service. I accompanied Jessica to church like any devoted husband would. She held my hand, smiled at our neighbors, and whispered compliments about how good Emily looked that morning, seated just a few pews ahead. It all looked so normal. It all felt so practiced. Pastor Graham stepped onto the pulpit, beginning his sermon about loyalty and community. The irony wasn't lost on me. Halfway through, Linda quietly handed the envelope to the head deacon sitting by the altar. His eyes skimmed the contents. His face fell. He leaned to whisper to another elder, then another. A wave moved through the front rows like ripples breaking the surface of a still pond. Jessica didn't notice at first, but I did, and Emily did too. By the time Pastor Graham called for closing prayer, the board stood. The head deacon interrupted mid-prayer, calmly but firmly requesting that Pastor Graham join them in the back. The room buzzed. Murmurs filled the sanctuary. Jessica shifted nervously beside me. "What's going on?" she whispered. I shrugged. "No idea." I almost smiled. Almost. Within 10 minutes, Pastor Graham never returned. The deacons did, however, and requested Jessica come with them. Her face drained of color. She glanced at me, eyes wide, silently begging for help. I kept my expression blank. The congregation sat stunned as the service abruptly dismissed without explanation. Jessica was escorted out the side door. The whispers started before we even stood to leave. Emily met me at the exit. No words, just a knowing look. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift off my chest. Not because I destroyed them, but because they destroyed themselves. Jessica showed up at the house 3 hours later, frantic and humiliated, banging on the door like the world was ending. I didn't flinch. I took my time walking over, opening it just enough to see the wild panic in her eyes. "David, please," she gasped, her voice breaking. "It's not what you think. They're overreacting. I can explain everything." She tried to push past me into the house, but I didn't budge. I stood firm, blocking the doorway. "Explain it to the church board," I said calmly. Her lip trembled. "David, please, they blindsided me. Pastor Graham said it was confidential counseling. That's all it was." I raised an eyebrow. Confidential counseling that required deleting reservations? Private late-night meetings? "Jessica, save the lies. I heard you. I saw you." Her hands gripped the doorframe. "You don't understand. I was lost. I needed guidance. He took advantage of me." I tilted my head. "So now you're the victim?" I could barely recognize the woman in front of me. The same woman who stood up at our wedding, vowed loyalty and love, now stood trembling, twisting the truth without a hint of shame. "Please," she whispered, tears now streaming. "We can fix this. No one has to know. You and me, we can start fresh. I'll do anything." I almost laughed. Anything. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry for being caught. "You don't get it," I said quietly. "Everyone already knows." I stepped back just enough to let her see the living room. Sitting on the coffee table were the printed reservation records, the transcripts of her deleted emails, and the letter the deacon himself had slipped in my mailbox after the emergency meeting earlier that afternoon. Jessica's eyes widened in horror. "You gave it to them. They deserve to know who they were trusting," I replied. Her knees buckled slightly. "David, you can't do this to me. You did this to yourself." I stepped forward, forcing her to step back onto the porch. "I made a mistake," she shrieked suddenly, her tears boiling into anger. "I was scared. I thought you were distant. I thought you didn't love me anymore. I tried to fill the emptiness. By sneaking around with the pastor, by plotting to distract me." My voice was steel. "I was distant because you were already gone, Jessica." She reached out to grab my arm. I stepped back. "Please, I love you," she cried. "No," I said firmly. "You love control. You loved knowing I trusted you. That's what you loved." She tried again. "You'll destroy everything. What will people say? They'll say I finally opened my eyes." Without another word, I shut the door in her face. I stood there, listening to her muffled sobs fading as she staggered back to her car. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel broken. I felt free. She had gambled that I would forgive. Instead, I closed the door on her without even blinking. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.